So I'll just start the recording. That's okay with everyone. Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, actually for today, Yaakov is not on. It's I guess I'm just talking. We're ladies and gentle, just one gentleman. So what we have here in Tanya, we're up to a very special spot. We're in the middle of learning in chapter 18. What we've been delving into is the power of the soul. What we've known in Tanya is that we have two souls. We have the godly soul, we have the animal soul, and they're constantly at battle. And as Tanya quoted from King Solomon, when this one is on top, the other one is on bottom. They're always bickering and they're always trying to get the attention of the kingdom, which is the body. What are they vying for? What are they fighting for? They're fighting for the person's thoughts, the person's speech, and the person's action. They want to be in charge. They want to drive the car. The godly soul wants the person's thoughts to be about God, to be about Torah. They want their speech to be about prayer, to be about positivity in the world. They want their action to be an action of mitzvahs. That's what the whole godly soul cares about. It's totally surrendered to God. All it cares and thinks about is what God wants. The selfish soul, the natural soul, or the animated soul, we call it also the animal soul, use whatever word you want, it's all about self. It's not necessarily a bad thing. It just cares about what's best for itself, just like an animal. Animals are great, but they're hungry, they're going to bark until they get food. If they're itchy, they're going to use either a palm tree to itch themselves or a Lexus. I don't care. Right now, I'm itchy. And I want 7-layer cake now. I'll go to wherever it takes to get that cake. It cares about itself. So on the surface, it's just fine. Give it what it wants. But eventually, it leads to more self and more self. And the more self it is, the less God is involved. The less God he welcomes in. So the animal soul tells the mind, the thought, speech, and action, think about what's best for you. The godly soul is think about what's best for God. And they're always fighting. The tzaddik is someone who's not fighting. The tzaddik, it's easy. All he thinks about, all he cares about is God. He doesn't have a fight. The animal soul is neutralized. The animal soul is void, doesn't have a voice. The Rasha is the opposite. By the Rasha, the animal soul is the only one in charge. The godly soul is the one that's kind of silenced and exiled. Therefore, a Rasha, whatever it wants to do, it does. That's why it's a Rasha. A Rasha doesn't necessarily mean an evil person. Rasha is someone who just cares about themselves. And therefore, they're weak. They're compromised. Whatever they feel they want to do, they're going to do. You hurt me, I'm going to hurt you back. You insulted me, I'm going to get back at you. Even if they're able to hold themselves back once or twice, but in a week they're going to get back at them, it's because they're weak. The Beinani is what the name of our Tanya is. It's called the Book of the Beinani, because the Beinani is all about that person who's struggling. He has that godly soul, he has that animal soul, and they're always at odds, and they're always fighting for control. So the tips, starting from chapter 12, after we see the biology, we see the insides of our soul, and the makeup of our soul. Each soul has the way we are wired to think. It's called Chachma, Bina, and Das. And the way we are to feel. The thoughts, the way we think will develop the feeling of the heart. So in Tanya, in chapter 12, at first it was teaching us the power of impulse control, the power that you have from birth, the very nature of who you are. God gave you this ability to control yourself. The fact is, I could control myself. The fact is, you can control yourself. You may not want to, but the fact is, when a cop pulls you over and he says, "Why were you speeding?" and you say, "I couldn't help myself," you could have helped yourself. You just chose to speed. And that's why he could write you a ticket, even though you say, "Oops," because you are in control of what you're planning to do. The fact is, I could control myself for 2 minutes. It may be harder to control myself for 24 hours, but if I take it 5 minutes at a time, I could do it. That's what the Beinani is. The Beinani is always practicing self-control. That's what we learned in chapter 12. And if it becomes easy for him, he's like what we quoted in chapter 15. In my own words, I said, he's the nerdy type. He's the goody-goody. It's easy for him to study. He's not easily tempted. I think the way that Tanya quoted is, I don't know if it said he's cold-blooded, but he's not heated. He's not like a Sephardi that gets heated by everything. He's your typical gefilte fish Ashkenaz that whatever. He's more cold. So the what we learned in chapter 15 is you have to press some buttons to get yourself motivated, because a Beinoni always has to be pushing to do more. The second it becomes easy and lax, that's when he starts falling. But here, once we finish chapter 15, the problem we've had is that eventually you could practice control for 5 minutes, for 10 minutes, for a week, but eventually it's exhausting. You can't have these fights inside your mind and these feelings inside your heart and always fight, always be trying to control yourself. Eventually your guard could be down. So we said by a Beinoni, he uses his time of prayer to be inspired. And hopefully that moments, that hour of prayer a day lasts him as inspiration for the rest of the day. The example we've given is the Beinoni is a person who's poor, and they take all the wood they have in the backyard, and for a cold day, like we're kind of experiencing today, we already put on our heat. Our kids were cold in the morning. So the Beinoni is a person who their home is cold. So they take all the wood in the morning because they don't have that much, and they heat up the house all at once, and they're hoping that the heat in the morning will last them for the whole day. The tzaddik, his moments of prayer is all day. He's always in a warm mentality to God. The Beinoni is going to get cooled down, and therefore he's just hoping that he pushes the heat in the morning, and he's hoping it's going to last for the rest of the day. That's the Beinoni, that he's hoping those moments of prayer will take him through the day, that he could be in control. But eventually it's going to be hard. We've given the example of the rubber band that you could pull, but eventually it's going to snap. So it's like the person coming into Yechidus, his private audience with the Rebbe, with the Alter Rebbe who's writing the Tanya, and he asks you, where are you holding? And you say, I'm doing the self-control, but Rebbe, eventually I'm going to give in. Eventually I can't keep this up. So the Rebbe says, control yourself, but let's dig a little deeper. Digging a little deeper, here we have two different paths. 16 and 17, we've had the path of let's dig into your mind. Instead of just focusing on our control of our thought, speech, and action, we're going to try to figure out what's going inside that brain of yours. We're going to start implementing some meditation. And when we have some meditation, you'll actually be more motivated to do the right thing. It won't always have to be a struggle and a control to do it. You'll actually enjoy it. But to enjoy it, you have to get your feelings in. To get your feelings in, you have to get your mind in. Because the mind, like we said before, the mind is like the parent that develops and gives birth to the feeling. Whatever you're going to have in your mind is going to become a feeling in your heart. If you don't care about something, it's because you didn't think about it enough. If you think about something, you'll either develop a love for it, or a hate for it, or a feeling of compassion and empathy for it, but you have to think about it first. When you think, eventually it'll develop a feeling of the heart. So what the Alter Rebbe in chapter 16 and 17 was saying was, let's focus on getting inside you. Let's take a deep dive into your mind that eventually will give it the right meditation so that it will develop a feeling. And when you have a good feeling towards God, it'll be easier to do the right thing. But in chapter 17, we says, oh, wait a minute, I'm a Beinoni, I'm a Rasha, I'm not yet a tzaddik. The meditation doesn't come easy. There seems to be a kink, a clog between the mind. I could try to meditate, but the meditation is not talking to me. I could pray, but it's not really realigning my heart. There seems to be a blockage. So we said, even if there's a blockage, you working on that meditation, God considers it as a grand thing. Even if you just develop a bit of an appreciation for God and for what God is doing, even that will be enough to bring you along and to get your emotions intact. And God gives it to you as a gift, we said. But that is one path. And really, later in the Tanya, we're going to be focusing a lot more on that path. It's going to take us, right now we're up to chapter 20, really in chapter 40, which will take us a good chunk of months to get to. That's where we're going to continue focusing on the meditations, what the meditations are, how they work, and how to implement them. But just the idea was that focus on the mind and the heart inside, and eventually that'll make it easier for you to control yourself. But now, chapter 18, we said, if those meditations are not working for you, you're not that type of guy, you're not that type of person who could just have meditations and at a whim bring it up and inspire you, don't worry. You are covered also. There is something inside of you that you don't even have to develop and create those feelings and that meditation. There's something inside of you that you have. It's called your special soul. In Hebrew, we call it over here the Ahava Misuteret. It's the hidden love for God that you already possess. You have it by nature. It's in you. So it's not something you have to go outside and buy. It's not something you have to work years in yeshiva to develop. You just have to uncover it. It's there. Reveal it. Tap into it. And the Rebbe goes in chapter 18 and 19. The Rebbe was explaining and defining what this love for God is. It coming from the root of our neshama, of our soul. To explain that, he explains what the soul is about. He explains the 10 sefirot, the different spiritual divine levels that we have inside of us. Starting from the highest of the 10 is Chachma. Chachma is, in the past I've translated as wisdom, but in this Tanya, he actually translated it as inquiry. Our soul has a level of Chachma, which is the inquiry of God. It's so close to God. When a person inquires about something, it's because they're humble enough to not think they know it all. They're inquiring, they're being creative, they're open to ideas. They're humbling themselves toward an idea outside of them. They're accepting an idea from outside. That's what an inquiry is. That's what the Tanya is telling us that the soul is about. It's humble. It's allowing God fully, God's divine infinite energy and light inside. So to get God's divine energy, which is infinite and all-encompassing, into us, God gave us this power of Chachma, which is this power of humility, which is the root of the soul, to think deeply an idea, but even more than just thinking, it's to have that innate faith in God. That's what our soul is about. And all the other levels of the soul are connected to that Chachma, to that original level. So there's different levels of souls within the Jewish people. You have, and because there's different levels of where the souls are manufactured in. There's different spiritual worlds, we said, and we didn't develop too much about it, but we said there's a world of emanation, which is the highest. It's called Atzilut. There's a world of creation, the world of formation, and the world of action, which is the world we're in now. Our souls come from different worlds, and within the world, there's 10 different levels, the Sefirot. But in truth, they're all interconnected, which means whatever level my soul is on, or whatever level your soul is on, ultimately, we have the same root. That root is Chachma. So you can have a person who perhaps is spiritually on a lower soul level, but they have that same root of Chachma that they just have to tap into and be ultimately connected with the divine and with the infinite. They have it already inside. That's the level of soul that we're talking about. It's the level of innate love that's hidden inside of you, and all you have to do is uncover it. This love is divine and infinite, because it's coming from this level of Chachma that is the conduit for godliness in our soul and in the world. So all we have to do is uncover it. And the fact is, any Jew, from the highest leader level to the lowest no-goodnik, sinner of sinners, when they're faced with a spiritual crisis, which means someone comes to them and says, bow to the cross, renounce your Judaism, or I will kill you. 9 out of 10, the Jew would say, I am Jewish. I will never separate myself from God. Even if this Jew never kept Shabbos before and never fasted on Yom Kippur or didn't do any of the practical things that the Torah says to do, and he really couldn't care less. But when it comes to renouncing his Judaism, he says, I can't. That would sever my connection from God. Never will I allow that to happen. How does he have that faith that's so strong if he never was practicing it? Because there's a level of his soul that is so strong. It's the root of his soul. It's Chachma. And when he feels that his relationship may be severed, now it never will be severed, but he feels this will separate me from God, then he'll say, I'll never bow to the cross, or I'll never renounce my Judaism, or whatever it is, that crisis of faith that he's having, he'll remain strong. Now, some question that came up in the past, and some people emailed me, was different stories of Jewish history. If you take the Marranos, for example, in the Spanish Inquisition in the late 1400s, 1492, they on the outside they renounce their Judaism. On the inside, of course, they remain strongly Jewish. So there's, of course, I still have to research these different moments of history, but almost throughout all of history, the Jewish people, take the story of Purim. We said, I'm never going to separate myself from God, even though they were on a very lowly spiritual state. They were partying with Haman before Haman came up with that decree, right? Why did this whole story happen? It's because they were partying in the non-kosher parties of the king and Haman, and they were getting a little too close and assimilated. That's what happened. But yet, not one Jew of that time ever thought about becoming Persian, because they had this power of soul that is from this level of chachma in our soul. So we also said that there's a power in that love for God. There's also the power of awe and reverence. That connected with this love comes this fear and saying, I never want to be disconnected from God. So a person may commit sins, but they could only commit them because they feel it's not that bad if I do this. I'm still connected to God. But if they would feel this would disconnect me, they would never commit it. And that's why when they're faced with a gunpoint and saying, renounce your Judaism, they feel that would sever their connection. They wouldn't do it. So that's just a little summary of where we got to. So the point of chapter 18 and 19 was to tell us that you don't only have to rely on meditations to get your emotions involved. You could actually trigger something even deeper than your emotions. You could press the right button and get your soul on fire. We know that when your soul is awake, it could do incredible things. It's on fire. It's so soulful. You're so alive. But the soul goes to sleep because it's covered by the schmutz of materialism. And what happens then is you forget all these things. Your soul, your divine energy is somewhat unconscious, but it becomes awakened when it's feeling a crisis. It'll come alive. So what we have to figure out now from chapter 20 to 24 really is going to be realizing that really every time we do a mitzvah, it's allowing that soul life. And then when we refrain from the mitzvah or when we do a sin, we are disconnecting to some level. So there's some heavy topics here that we're going to be uncovering. But to understand the power of the mitzvah, we're going to go through a whole philosophical chapter over here to really develop the understanding of what a mitzvah is and the divinity of it. And then we'll see a really amazing point over here is what we call non-dual Judaism, where in our Jewish lens, it's a spiritual idea. Nothing is outside of God. Everything is part of God. There's no duality. It's non-dual. So we'll have to see that inside. So I'm going to pull up on the screen. Let me just take some questions first. I hope that summary was somewhat helpful.
Rabbi, if I might add something, I took a 3 or 4 session class this summer from Professor Gampil, who was a professor of Jewish history at the Jewish Theological Seminary, on Jews in Christian Spain, and I learned so much. I wound up buying this book, which he didn't write. He's got books on it. It's called A History of the Jews in Christian Spain. He has a nice introduction to it, Professor Gampil, and he talks about the tens of thousands of Jews who converted for real in Spain and converted on the surface and were burned at the stake.
Yeah.
It was only the ones who said not the Jews who remained Jews in Spain who were murdered, but it was the ones who said they became Christians. Those are the ones who were murdered, tens and tens and tens of thousands of them. Anyway, this book is so good.
And I'll be reading. It's more of a text-based class. I hope you guys can see. 3, 2, 1. Let me push this aside. So we're learning in chapter, can everyone see the screen? Just in case it's easier on the, I don't think I know how to zoom in, but I'm pretty sure on your screen you could zoom in. I don't know if I could zoom in from here. I might change the page. Okay. So non-dual Judaism, if you're looking inside your text in your book, It's on 231. If you're looking obviously on the Kindle, on the screen, it's right smack at the top. Section 1, the first 2 commandments. In chapter 18, the Tanya began to explain how worshiping God is very much within reach, based on the idea that we have all inherited a love for God built into our souls. That's this hidden love for God. In chapter 19, we learned that while this love may remain dormant, it will surface even in the most sinful person when faced with a test of faith, convert or die. This, however, leaves us with the original question in chapter 18 unanswered. The question was, if our dormant love only surfaces with the test of faith, how does that make worship very much within reach in an everyday setting, when our lives are not threatened by a religious ultimatum? The answer to this question will require us to have a crash course in higher consciousness. The Tanya will spend the next 4 chapters elaborating on what is sometimes referred to as the non-dual idea that everyone and everything manifests God. So before I turn the page, just to explain this last idea, in the index page, there's one idea that I missed before. In the index page to Tanya, when the Alter Rebbe is giving a synopsis of what we're going to be learning, he quotes a verse from Deuteronomy on the last days of Moshe's life, where Moshe says, this thing, Torah, mitzvahs, karov elecha hadavar me'od. It is very near to you. Beficha, in your mouth, ubelvavcha, in your heart, lasoto, to do it. So what we've been trying to figure out is, how is it easy? How is it accessible? So we said there's meditations. And even more than that, the verse says it is very easy. So to explain why it's very easy, we said because you don't even have to go outside of you to find it. It's already in your soul, inherited from Abraham as a gift to every single one of us, this innate love for God. That's why it's very easy to tap into it. But what we just explained is, when does it get triggered? When does this love come alive? When is it awakened? When we have a spiritual crisis of faith. When someone is saying, you can't be Jewish anymore. Then it comes alive. My essence of Judaism, my soul is awakened. But what happens when it's just a regular Wednesday morning? When things are normal, I don't have any crisis. My soul is not that on fire. How do I trigger it then? So to explain how it could be triggered, not only in a time of danger, in a time of severe crisis, but on your regular Tuesday afternoons, now we're going to have to go through an explanation of mitzvahs. And the next 4 chapters is going to explain this non-dual idea. So it's a higher consciousness that we're going to be delving into. We'll see how it goes. If it's a little too heavy to do through Zoom, we may skip a couple chapters and go to chapter 26, which is really the next section of Tanya. And just to jump ahead, chapter 26 is the most important chapter of Tanya. It talks about how to deal with depression, with sadness, with struggles that come up in your way, how to incorporate that in your service, and using your soul in the right direction. It's an incredible section of Tanya. I'm kind of tempted to skip to there, but we'll go through this high conscious and crash course ideas. Let's share the screen again, and I hope that was clear. Let's see it inside. Eventually, in chapter 25, I'm all the way at the top, we will return to answer the question remaining from chapter 18. Our discussion will center on the teaching of the Zohar, which the Tanya now cites. So now we're going to learn a little bit of Zohar. It goes like this. Now, this thing is known, and that's a quote from Isaiah, that verse, to everybody. So this is known. We should know this already. What is it? That the mitzvah to accept only one God and the biblical prohibition against idolatry, which are the first 2 of the 10 commandments. And to quote the 10 commandments is, I am your God. That's commandment number 1. And you shall not have any other gods. Commandment number 2. So this mitzvah to accept one God and to not worship any other idol, any other God, that's the first 2 commandments. But the Zohar says are a comprehensive statement which thematically incorporate the whole Torah. Since the commandment, I am God, incorporates all the 248 positive mitzvahs, And the commandments, you shall not have any other gods, incorporates the 365 prohibitions. All the mitzvahs are, in essence, an affirmation of monotheism and a rejection of idolatry, which is the theme of the first two commandments. The 248 positive commandments are you shalls, are an affirmation of one God. And the 365 prohibitions, you shall nots, are a repudiation of idolatry. So when God says, you shall keep Shabbos, make the Shabbos holy, Zachar et Yom HaShabbat lekadsho, remember the day of Sabbath, to sanctify it, that's a positive mitzvah. So it's about affirming my monotheistic belief that in one God. So all the mitzvahs that are yushals, and there's 248 positive mitzvahs they're called, are all connected with the original positive mitzvah, which is I am your God, meaning only believe in one God. Whereas the second commandment, which is you shall not have any other gods, is the root of all the 365 negative mitzvahs, which are the you shall nots, meaning like you shall not do any work on Yom Kippur, and you shall not abuse orphans and widows. All that is part of the you shall nots, the negative mitzvahs, which are all rooted in the first negative mitzvah, which is the second commandment, you shall not serve any other God. So that's a teaching of the Zohar, that the first and the second mitzvah, the first positive and the first negative, are the root of all the 613 mitzvahs. And that is why we only heard the first two commandments. I am God, your God, and you shall not have any other gods, directly from the mouth of God. As our sages of blessed memory taught, that God said just the first two of the 10 commandments, and the remainder was transmitted by Moses. So this is from the Talmud, in Tractate Shabbat. The Jews said, Moshe, don't let God speak to us anymore. We can't handle it. We're going to die. So after the first two commandments, Moshe actually spoke the last 8. The elevation of our souls was just on such a dangerously high level that we couldn't take it anymore. And Rashi right away comments on the 10 commandments that the first two Moshe, God said, and the last 8, the Jews requested of Moshe that he should continue it. Because for God to say the rest of the commandments was unnecessary, since the first two incorporate the whole Torah. So it almost seems like a cop-out. We actually didn't get 10 commandments from God. We only got 2 commandments from God. So he's saying, no. The first 2 commandments already include the rest of the 611 other ones, because the root of the first 2 have all of the rest of them in them. So when God said the first 2 commandments, he, by default, already said the entire Torah, all the positive and all the negatives. The fact that God just spoke 2 commandments sent a clear message that Judaism can be summed up in just 2 themes: accept one God and do not accept idolatry. From this, it follows that every mitzvah at its core is a rejection of idol worship. So obviously we're going to have to delve into this idea and we're going to continue it. But we've learned this before in Tanya, that anything, idol worship is not just bowing to a stone. Idol worship is worshiping the stock market, or worshiping another person, or worshiping your car, or worshiping your job. All that is part of idol worship. When God says you shall not do that, if you say, you know what, I don't care, I'm going to do it, you're worshiping a feeling inside of you that is really controlling you. All that is part of idol worship. It's a more updated version of idol worship, but it's the same idea that either God's in charge, or I'm in charge, or this person's in charge. So all that is part of idol worship. So the first 2 mitzvahs, which are all about believe in one God and don't serve other gods, all about the prohibition against idolatry, is inclusive of the entire Torah. Section 2, the non-duality of God. Let me just, are there any questions? Okay. In order to have clarity in this matter, meaning how the first 2 commandments are inclusive of all the other ones, we first need to mention briefly over the next 2 chapters. So it's not so brief. 2 chapters take us quite a while to get through, but the concept and deep ideology of God's non-duality. So buckle up. Hope you had a satisfying breakfast this morning, because we're going to be going into a deep dive of some good stuff. One of the most striking contributions of the Kabbalah, which became a central idea in Hasidic thought, was a highly innovative reading of the monotheistic idea. The belief in one God is no longer perceived as the mere rejection of other deities or intermediaries, but a denial of any existence outside of God. Hold on one second, everyone. I'm getting a call from the hospital. I think it's someone I know. I'm just going to be right back. Okay? Respite before we continue our deep dive, but here we go. We're going to quote the Ramak. Ramak was one of the teachers of the Arizal. His name was Rabbi Moshe Carvero. He died in the 1500s. He's buried in Tzfat. I've been to his burial site in the cemetery of Tzfat, right next to his student, the Ari, the Rabbi Isaac Luria. But his teacher he was known as Ramak by the acronyms of his name, of the RMC, or K, Rabbi Moshe Cordovero. And he explains like this: before anything was emanated, that's better. Here we go. Before anything was emanated, there was only the infinite one Ein Sof, which was all that existed. And even after he brought into being everything which exists, there is nothing but him. And you cannot find anything that exists apart from him, God forbid. For nothing exists devoid of God's power. For if there were, he would be limited and subject to duality, God forbid. Rather, God is everything that exists, but everything that exists is not God. Nothing is devoid of his godliness. Everything is within it. There is nothing but it. And this is quoted from a bunch of sources. And I'm just curious to know the it, and I'm not that good in Canadian, I have my Canadian grammar, but shouldn't the it be with an I, with a capital I, it's referring to godliness? Nothing is devoid of his godliness. Everything is within it. There is nothing but it. I'm just wondering, there's no spelling mistakes in this Tanya, so I'm wondering if maybe it is referring to something else. I'm just going to go back to allow everyone to ponder this concept. Oops, hold on. Let me just go back a moment. It's a powerful idea from Rabbi Moshe Cordovero, that everything in the world exists from God. Everything is part of God.
We're not pantheists. Yeah, we're not pantheists. We don't worship things in the world.
And if you say that this is something and God is not here, God is not in this, you're actually saying that God is not God, because you're limiting God. God is infinite. The second you're saying this is God and that is something else, you're actually limiting God, and that makes God not God anymore. That's duality. So, and the last few lines is a pretty heavy line. Nothing exists, there's nothing that could exist other than God. So listen to this: nothing is devoid of his holiness, of his godliness. Everything is within it, and there's nothing but it. Seems like a pretty repetitive term. Nothing is devoid. Everything is within. There's nothing but it. Okay, so the good thing is the Alter Rebbe in Tanya here is going to be clarifying this Kabbalistic idea. But it's the idea of non-duality, where there's nothing in the world, or nothing, forget about not only in our world, there's nothing that exists outside of God. Let's try to understand this a little more. This idea is often referred to as the duality of God, of the non-duality of God. To say that the created world is a separate substance from God would imply a certain duality. That there are two types of existence in the universe, the divine and the non-divine. In the non-dual vision, there's only one existence or substance, God. Everything else is simply dissolved or absorbed in that oneness. So all that exists is God. And in that oneness, everything else is contained in. This concept, now this is actually quoting from the Rebbe. In this next paragraph, he's quoting from a letter of the Rebbe. It's quoted in the book, The Letter and the Spirit. It's a beautiful translation or English letters that the Rebbe wrote. And the Rebbe comments on this like this. This concept is one of the central aspects of man's purpose in life, to establish this truth and to spread it to the utmost extent of his influence. What's the truth? That there's only one true truth, the oneness of God. And that's actually our mission, to spread this oneness of God in the world. This is not merely an idea, but a way of life which is expressed in daily life and which permeates the whole inner being of a chassid. Wow. Let's read one more paragraph, and then I need to clarify a couple of things. Obviously, the non-dual reality is an extremely subtle concept, and it is something to which a second book of Tanya, which is Shar Hayichud Ve'emuna. By that time, friends, I'll definitely have a white beard when we get to studying that section of Tanya. So there's a few sections to Tanya. The first section is called the Book of the Beitini, is what we're learning. The second section is called the Shar Hayichud Ve'emuna. That's where it talks about the oneness of God in the world. It's 12 chapters long, but it's very philosophical, explaining the concept of oneness of God. And the third section of Tanya is actually a beautiful one. It's about Teshuvah. It's a letter the Alter Rebbe wrote about Teshuvah. Also, I think it's 12 or 13 chapters long. But our section now is 53 chapters. For the remainder of this chapter and the next, we will only touch upon the concept briefly. First, the Tanya offers some scriptural and rabbinic references that are suggestive of non-duality. So just to pause for a moment, I'll also take some questions, but it's actually beautiful to learn about this non-duality this week, because this week we're learning about Avram in the Torah portion, the parsha of the week. It's about Abraham, the first Jew. Abraham's main concern was bringing godliness into the world. That's actually what Abraham's job was. He was a pioneer of bringing godliness in the world. And not only saying there's a God and there's a world, but to show how the whole world is God. There's nothing devoid of godliness. It's in the first talk our Rebbe gave in 1951, when he assumed the leadership upon the death and the passing of his father-in-law, the previous Rebbe. One of the first things he said was that our job is to be like Avraham. Avram went places, traveled to share and to teach the monotheistic idea of oneness of God, but not, and here's a beautiful concept, there's a quote from the Talmud that the Rebbe says that wherever Avram did, the wording of the Torah is, Vayikra Sham b'Shem Hashem El Olam, that he called out there in the name of God, master of the world, that God is the master of the world. The Talmud says the word Vayikra means, and he called out, but the word Vayikra, there's no vowels in the Torah, there's no dots, so one word could be pronounced a few ways. There's no vowels. So the word Vayikra would mean he called out. The word Vayakri, which has the same letters, just a different vowel, would mean he got others to call out. So the Talmud says, not only did he call out, you could also read this Vayakri, which means he had others call out, which means his job was to go around and to teach the oneness of God, not just for himself or his family, but to bring that monotheistic idea of oneness of God to the world. But the Rebbe clarifies one more point on that, is he didn't say Kel Ha'olam, that God is the God over the universe. He said Kel Olam. There's only one letter that's missing there. He was master of universe, which means there wasn't a master and a universe. It was one thing. Master of the universe would mean it's like two separate things. There's the master, which is God, and there's a universe, which is us, and God is in control. That's not it. No. That's not what Avram is trying to teach. That's not the essence of monotheism. Monotheism means, the way we're learning it now according to Kabbalah and Chassidus, is that it's all coming from God. It's not just that there's God and there's a world. The whole world is God. There's nothing else other than God. Whatever you see in the world is God. You just have to uncover the godliness in it. But there's nothing that can exist outside of God. That's monotheism, where not only we believe that there's one God and not two, but we believe that everything is God. And if you say that there's a thing that's not God, then there is no God. You're not believing in God. Belief in God means belief in one God, which is the verse we say in Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. When we say God is the one, not just one and not two, one and everything. The oneness of God is revealed in everything. That's what Shema means. And that's what we're going to be touching upon over here, this non-duality, which is, again, a very Kabbalistic idea. And it seems like it's a novel idea over the past 500 years that wasn't spoken or taught before Rabbi Moshe Cordovero in 1570, or before the Alter Rebbe quotes it in Tanya in the late 1700s. So it's belief in the devil and Hashem, then duality. No, I don't know what you mean by devil, but if you mean like Satan, the Satan, and it just the reason why the word devil for me just looks like the guy with the pitchfork and the horns and the fire behind him, but the Satan is doing God's job, right? The Satan is hired by God, and which is the root of where the animal soul comes from. Just to explain, it's all the devil is actually ego. That's just a better word for devil. And God made ego for us to have free will, right? That's all part of it. Just to explain, there's a beautiful story. I'll just try to share it quickly. Of a chassid who once came to the Mittler Rebbe. The Mittler Rebbe was the son of the Alter Rebbe, who were learning his book. The Alter Rebbe, Reb Shneur Zalman of Liadi, he died in 1812. He was succeeded by his son, whose name was Rabbi Dov Ber, who in 1812 became Rebbe until the 1820s, till he passed away. And a chassid of his came for a correction, and he had a lot of ego, and the Rebbe, a chassid by nature means you're humbled, right? A chassid by nature, whatever comes his way, he's happy because it's coming from God. Where does anger come from? We learned this in chapter 1. It comes from my ego. How dare you do that to me? Do you know who I am? That's where anger comes from. So the Rebbe rebuked him for his ego. And he says, I have a shtick. Shtick is a Yiddish word, a shtick yesh. I have it's not even a full ego. Yesh is an ego. I have a little yesh. I have a little ego. It's not even that bad. It's just a little ego. Everyone has a little ego. And the Rebbe, the Mittler Rebbe told him, let me tell you what's happening behind the scenes. He told them that Adam and Eve were in the Garden of Eden. And there was a snake. Sorry, even before. When God created the world, he brought this shining light to the world. So the Satan, which God created, or the devil, if you want to call him, told God, how am I, with this powerful light, how am I ever going to entice anyone to sin? It's going to be impossible. So God removed the light, and he disguised the Satan into a snake. And the snake did his job. He convinced Adam and Eve to eat, to do the first sin, and brought a sense of impurity to the world, etc. But then he went back to God. He says, okay, and now the show is over. Everyone knows who I am. No one's going to listen to me anymore. So he disguised the snake, the Satan, he put him into a different disguise. And he put him into, so here I have to remember the details of the story. He put him into, hold on, what was the next thing? There's a few steps to it. He put him into idol worship. And idol worship was going to be the temptation of the Jew to try to tempt us. As Satan became disguised in the temptation of idol worship. And when the sin of the golden calf happened and we worshiped the idol and we did teshuvah after, he went back to God. He said, the Satan said, my disguise is up. Everyone knows, and they're not going to, they see the severity of idol worship. She says, I'm going to disguise you again. Don't worry, you're still going to be involved. And it's going to go through lust and forbidden temptations and desires. And then the Jews sinned with that, with the story of Pinchas, and later in the times of the Talmud. And again, the Satan came and says, my disguise is up. So he says, I'm going to put you back. You're going to be an animal soul. I'm going to put you into their soul, and you're going to tempt them with this and with that. And eventually, the Baal Shem Tov came, and he uncovered the idea that we could control our animal soul. So the Satan came back to God, and he says, my disguise is up. The animal soul is not really working anymore. He says, I'm going to put you in the disguise of ego, yesh. And ego will be the source of where you could implement your free will for the person. And then came along the Tanya, and it's all about teaching us how to control our ego and how to surrender and be humble. In Hebrew, the word that Maddie always enjoys is bitul, the idea of humility and surrender. He says, I can't do my job anymore. I'm quitting. So the God told him, I'm going to put you not only in as an ego, I'll put you in the disguise of a shtik yesh, which means you almost convince yourself it's not that bad. It's not really an ego. It's just a sliver of an ego. But really, it's the same snake. It's the same Satan. It's the same through it all. So really, it's something that we have to correct and realize and be conscious of. I hope I got that story right. Something like that. So in their discussion about the Satan embodied by the serpent found it. Oh, awesome. That's exactly great. I meant to say serpent found the story of Adam and Eve. Awesome. Satan is hired by God. So that. Okay, awesome. So that's exactly right. I'll continue sharing my screen. So what was the point of me sharing all that story? That this is the central aspect, that our job of being a chassid is to reveal the oneness of God in the world, that there's no duality, that's what Avram did, and that's what our job is. Let's continue. So obviously we're towards the bottom of the page in the Kindle, or 233 in your book. Obviously the non-dual reality is an extremely subtle concept. And it is something to which the second book of Tanya, Shari Chivamuna, devotes much attention. Oh, we said that. So let's see some of the scriptural sources. In the Midrash, God is referred to as the one and the only one, implying that he is the only existence. And in the liturgy, it is written, everyone believes of him that he is the only one, which is we say on the high holidays, which implies that he remains now exactly the same as he was before the world was created, when he was alone and there was no other entity in the universe. As we say, you were alone before the world was created, you are alone since the world has been created. We say that every morning, which in a non-dual reading means that he literally has not changed, and God remains the only existence in the universe. Even after he created the world, as the verse states, I, God, have not changed. That's a very important verse. Ani Hashem lo shaniti. I have never changed. What that is telling us is that with whatever happens, God, before the world was created, and even after the world was created, the world's creation didn't change God. The way you, just to explain that, when a person has a child, they're a changed person. Because they react to things differently. They see the world a little differently. When I was a bachelor, I changed after when I got married and when I had a child. My routine, my schedule, my reactions, my patience, all of it had to change. I'm not the same freelance anymore. But God didn't change. He created a world, but he remained the same God as he was before the world was created. Clearly, the world does exist. That we can't deny. The world is here. Even non-dual Judaism does not maintain that we see is an illusion. It simply sees the universe as subsumed within God, having no separate identity from him. This means that God's sole existence prior to creation has not changed, since creation did not produce any new entity outside of God. Creation didn't produce any new entity. It was all part of God's entity. Okay, I'm going to read. There's a nice lesson on 233. We don't have it in the Kindle on the screen, but it's just a one sentence. The practical lesson reads like this. Let me just stop sharing this for a moment. Every mitzvah is, in essence, either an affirmation of the one God or a repudiation of idol worship. So when we have the positive mitzvahs and the negative mitzvahs, they're all stemming from the same source. Is this affirming God's oneness? And is this, by not serving other gods, which is the root of all negative mitzvahs, it's pushing away a repulsion toward idol worship. We'll actually stop it there today, but this idea and allow people to ponder on this idea that there's nothing in the world that exists other than God, and yet when God created the world, it's all contained within his oneness, and it didn't change God at all. God remains the same as he was before the world was created, after he was after the world was created. We'll pause it there. We're at the bottom of 233, and we have a lot to study now. Everyone have a great week. Look around and see the oneness of God in everything that you are